Welcome to the How to Program with Java podcast, where all you need is the desire to learn, and you too can become a Java programmer with absolutely no knowledge of programming. And now, your host, Trevor Page.
Hey, my faithful listeners. Welcome back to episode number 57 of the How to Program with Java podcast. As always, I will be your host for today, Trevor Page, and I'm ready to bring it to you with some cool content. So continuing in our beautiful journey of Hibernate and all things databases and SQL, well, I guess not SQL, but databases, I'm going to be talking about a very important topic with respect to understanding how to use this Hibernate stuff. So we've talked about relationships as it pertains to databases. We've talked about relationships as it pertains to annotations like one-to-many or at one-to-many, at many-to-many, at one-to-one. I'm sure you guys are very well versed in this by now. But really, I want to talk a little bit more about some properties or some important aspects when it comes to relationships, and that is fetch types. Now, you may have seen this before. I'm not sure if I may have hinted at it before or not, but if you are completely oblivious of fetch types, that's perfectly okay, because that's exactly what I'm going to be covering today. So I'm really just going to jump right into the content because I know this is going to be a good episode. This is actually one of my most popular blog posts. So I didn't even have a podcast episode that accompanied this particular blog post, but it is my number one blog post. So I figured, why not record a podcast for it? It makes perfect sense to introduce it right now since we're completely caught up with relationships. So I'm very excited to record this and just get going with it. So I guess if you're listening to this as part of this blog post and you've never heard of this podcast before, you might want to consider subscribing to the podcast because I give away some really great stuff, completely free, all for you. You can go to howtoprogramwithjava.com/love, Love, and that will bring you to the actual iTunes app where you can subscribe. You can click the subscribe button just below the actual graphic logo of the How to Program with Java podcast. And hey, if you like this episode and you want to leave a rating and review, you can do so in the exact same screen. So, cool. Having said that, diving into the content for today, we're talking about two different types of fetching because there are only two types of fetching: lazy fetching and eager fetching. Okay, so first let's talk a little bit about why fetching even exists in the first place. Why is this a concept that you need to learn today? So fetching is all about, well, it pertains to relationships. Fetching exists because relationships exist. If we didn't have a relationship between two objects, we wouldn't care about how we fetched the data between the objects. But because we do have relationships, we care about how to fetch the data. Now, Hibernate, this is a Hibernate topic for the record. Hibernate has these fetch types, eager and lazy. I'll start with eager fetching, and then we can move into lazy fetching. But eager fetching means that anytime you are querying the database via a Hibernate code, so whether it's like, session.get or session.load or session.create criteria, if you are in some way, shape, or form querying the database by using the Hibernate syntax, then what happens is it has a choice to make. It will go through and it will query the data or the database for your object. So let's use the example of users and addresses. Let's have a one-to-many relationship between a user and a user's addresses. So one user maps to many addresses. Now, and by addresses, I mean physical addresses with street, city, state, zip code, all that stuff. So you have this relationship between these two objects, and you want to retrieve a user object from the database. So you probably do, you initialize your Hibernate session, and you say session dot get or dot create criteria, and you're querying for the user object, et cetera, et cetera. So let's say you pass in the actual key or the ID for the user that you want to query for. Let's say it's just user ID 1. We're just querying for the very first user in the system. And what happens? Well, if you are using the fetch type of eager, what will happen is Hibernate will fetch that particular piece of data, and it will realize that there are joins inside of that object. The user is joined to addresses. So since it knows that it's joined to addresses, it can do a smart query. It can query for users, and it can join with addresses. So it will do a select star from users, join addresses on whatever it would be, user.userid is equal to address.userid, because one-to-many means you have the parent's key as a foreign key on the child, which is, user is the parent, child is address. On the address table, we'd have user ID. Anyway, you get the idea. So it will automatically put in that join. Okay, and you might think that that's a good thing because it seems like a good thing. It certainly works great if you have, only one relationship inside of your particular object, and that only goes to a fairly finite number of other objects as the child part of the relationship, right? Then it works perfectly. But the downside to using the eager fetch type is that it will load all of the relationships if there are several. Okay, so let's say there are not just one relationship mapping. Let's say user maps to addresses and user profiles and, user login details, user history, who knows, however many different types of relationships you can have. And what happens if those other objects have relationships to other objects and you just keep using the eager fetch type? Well, what happens is if you do a simple query, like you just want to get... Let's say you just want to get the user to find out if their user credentials are correct. So let's say you are in a situation where you are logging into the system. So someone has typed in a username and a password, and you just want to validate whether or not the username and password are correct. Well, when you have a eager fetch type, meaning eager fetches all of the relationships all at once, all you want to do is just validate that logic, the username and password are correct, which is just, exists on the base There's no joins that are needed to get that information. It's all on the user table. We don't need to make any joins. But what the fetch type of eager does is that it will go and it will join to all of the other objects. Okay? So it will do a join to addresses, and it will do a join to the profiles, and it will do a join to the user history, and it will do a join to the login history, and you get the idea. It does all these unnecessary joins to all these other objects and loads it all into memory. Okay, that's what Hibernate does. It takes what's in the database and loads it into memory in Java so that you can use it as a Java object. But all you wanted to do in the first place was just validate if the username and password were valid. Okay, but you've wasted all of these resources, all this time, all the trips to the database, memory. All this is wasted because you're not going to use all that information. You're not going to use all the things that you're joining to. So I hopefully you can understand the direction that I'm going here. That using the eager fetch type, might be easy to implement, but it is a huge waste of resources in the long run. Okay, so now let me give you a breakdown of the lazy loading. So probably you can figure out where I'm going with lazy loading and how it pertains as the antagonist to the eager fetch type, or maybe the protagonist, depending on how you like to look at it. So the lazy fetch type will not fetch any of the relationships. Okay, all it will do is fetch exactly what the base type object is. So if you are doing a lazy load and you're doing a query on the user object, it will just load the user object. It does the equivalent of a select star from the user table. Okay, all it will do is get just the base fields, which is username, password, email address, whatever else happens to be stored on the user table, and that is it. It does not join to the address table. It does not join to the user profile table. It does not join anywhere else. It just does the select star from user. Now, that's perfect in a situation where you just want to, query the user table and see if your login credentials are correct. But what now happens if you wanted to get access to the address information? All right, and that's what we'll get into in a second. I want to get into a little bit of syntax first, and then I'll talk about the actual functionality of this code. So you might be asking yourself, okay, how do I get the idea? I get the basic concept of eager fetch versus lazy fetch, but how do I actually implement this in my code? How do I tell it to do an eager fetch or a lazy fetch? Well, believe it or not, when you are, specifying your relationships using Hibernate, so you're using the annotations, the @one-to-many or @one-to-one or @many-to-many, once you've created that annotation and put in all that code, just like we've done many times before in the past 3 episodes, we've been talking about this, then by default, if you don't specify anything else other than your cascade, which you need to make sure you do, if you don't specify anything else, by default, it uses a lazy fetch type. Okay, you might not have known that, but it uses the lazy fetch type. So if you don't specify anything, that's what it's going to use. However, you can, inside of your annotation for your relationship, you can specify a fetch type. So along with your cascade, so again, let's assume you're using the one-to-many situation here. Let's talk about the child side of the relationship. So we're looking at the at many-to-one annotation. So in the at many-to-one annotation, you'll have cascade equal to most likely your cascade type all, and then you can put a comma in and you can say fetch. Okay, I believe it's fetch. Let me just double check that. Yes, so just fetch equals, and then you can specify which fetch type you want to use. Now in this case, like I said, since the easier way to do it, but the less performant way to do it, is to say fetch type dot eager. Okay, and then there you go. You've specified the fetch type of eager, and if this is a bidirectional relationship, then you need to make sure you go on to the parent side of the relationship, and in the at one-to-many annotation, beside your cascade, you'd also put fetch equals fetch type dot eager. Okay, so then that's how you do it. If you have a small enough system, if you don't have a whole lot of joins, if you don't expect there to be a whole lot of joins and relationships on a particular object, then it's not really that bad to use the fetch type of eager. Or if you're in a situation where you know in every single case you need to use every single type or every single join, every single relationship that exists in that object. If you know for a fact that you're always going to be using that, then it makes a whole lot of sense to use fetch type eager, because you can save yourself a lot of coding. Not a lot of coding, but you'll save yourself some coding in the long run. So that's some examples when you would use the eager fetch type. But in most scenarios, you're going to have a system which is going to have a lot of joins in their objects, and you're not always going to have to use all of those joins in one case versus another. So really, you should prefer to use the lazy loading method. So again, if you wanted to be explicit about it, you could say fetch equals fetch type dot lazy. Okay, but again, like I said, if you don't specify a fetch type, because it is optional, if you don't specify a fetch type, it defaults to lazy, and then you don't need to be explicit about it if you don't want to. Okay, so that's really all there is in terms of that particular coding and that particular syntax. There's a little bit more obviously involved with lazy loading with coding, and I guess that's what we'll get into now. So if you are going to be creating this lazy fetch type, if you're going to be utilizing the lazy fetch type, and like I said, you should be, because in the majority of these situations you are going to need to use this, then how do you make this work appropriately? Well, I can tell you about a scenario where it won't work properly, and then we can work from there. So let's say we have, like I said, the user and addresses or address objects. They've been created as normal. They have the one-to-many relationship. Everything is as it should be. Fantastic. So then we want to, let's say we've populated some data in there. There's already a user in there with some addresses. There could be several users and obviously many addresses. Whatever the situation is, there at least has to be one user with at least one address associated to that user, okay, for this scenario to work. So fair enough. That can be our scenario. We have, let's say, user T-Page with an address of 123 Fake Street in Toronto, Ontario, or something. So we have that information in the database. Now we want to retrieve that information. So how do we do that? Well, let's say we have a controller somewhere, and because it's part of our coding for our application, let's say we want to retrieve it because we are looking at the actual user details. Okay, let's say you have logged in and you are on a screen where you want to look at your user account. So you click on your account button, and on the account page that displays, you want to display your username and all the information related to the user, as well as the addresses associated, etc., etc. Okay, that's the page that we want to load. So what we would do to load that page and to load the details into the model of that page via the MVC design pattern, got to make sure I put in the nod for the MVC because it's very important. How do we display those details? So typically we have a controller. Let's say the controller would be as part of the user account controller or something, and we want to load the data to populate the model. So we make a request. We call the DAO. So we make a request to the DAO object. Okay, the data access object, and we say get user by ID. Okay, and the get user by ID method, we pass in the user ID, which let's say in this case is 1, because this is the first user that we've created. We want to get the details for that user. And what happens? Well, inside of the DAO, typically speaking, what I've shown you how to do it before is you go into the DAO and you will create a method that will, the get user by ID method, and it will use a session factory, and it will invoke session dot get current session, session factory dot get current session, and we'll say session dot you can do create criteria. I believe that's the way I talked about it before, was create criteria, but you can also say .get and just specify the class as well as the ID. So that's a simpler way to do it. You could say session.get, we pass in the user class, and we specify the user ID, which is 1, and we finish our statement, and that returns an object, and there we go. So that's the user object that we will then populate into the model. Now, the problem with this approach is that we have a situation where we want to display the user details, rather the user address information. Okay, that's what we're going to be pulling from on the actual view. We're actually going to try to pull the user details, so the address information on the view itself. So let's pretend there's code somewhere else that does a user.get address, or rather user.get addresses. All right. When that code is run, when that code gets executed, it does user.get addresses, but because we are outside of the scope of the initial transaction that has occurred, so the transaction will occur inside of the DAO, the data access object. So if you can picture a DAO in your mind, you picture that get user by ID method that we just talked about. Okay, that's the DAO, and that's where it does all the session.get. I'm passing the user ID and all that stuff. Inside of the scope of that method is the scope of the session. So as soon as we exit that method, as soon as that method returns our user object that we just used to query the database with, as soon as we exit that, the session closes. And that's a good thing. That's what we wanted to do. That's what our Spring and Hibernate frameworks that talk to each other nicely and play nicely together, that's what it does on our behalf, so we don't have to write out lots of boilerplate transaction level code. Okay, if we didn't have Spring and Hibernate working together for us, we'd have to type in, session.begin transaction, session.close, and we'd have to do all the sort of stuff related to transaction management. Okay, I've never talked about that before because I'd never needed to talk about it, because that's what Spring and Hibernate handle for us. Okay, it's a lovely framework. It really frees us up to have to write less code. However, since we are now outside of the session has closed, and we are inside of the presentation layer, and we are making reference to user.get addresses. User.get addresses, when we make reference to that, Hibernate tries to invoke the join. It tries to get the data related to the user via doing a join. So it has to do the select star from user, join addresses on, etc., etc. So it tries to do the join. But the session is closed, so we actually get an exception being thrown. Okay, the session is closed, so we get I believe, lazy instantiation exception. Okay, or lazy initialization exception, something along the lines of that. And you might scratch your head and say, well, what's going on here? Why is this code not working? And especially if the code is in the controller or in the presentation layer, it's even more of a pain in the butt to track down the bug. So this is happening because you did not properly tell Hibernate that we want to actually use that join for this particular situation. Okay, so typically the solution to this is to create a method. Whenever we know we are going to be utilizing a join, you can create a method for that. Okay, that's one way to do it. This is a little bit of a more lazy way to approach the situation, but this is a situation I've used, and it works fine for me. If you are in a situation where you have lots and lots and lots and lots of different potential joins happening, then you'll probably want to use a different approach. But for now, for our situation, what we can do is we can create a different method. So instead of saying get user by ID, that can be one method. That's great. That works fine. But we can create a second method that's get user by ID with addresses. Okay, so that can be the name of our method. Okay, the name obviously isn't critically important, but that's kind of how the convention that I follow. Whenever I'm creating code that actually invokes a join, I'm going to put in the name of the join inside of the method name. So get user by ID with addresses. Okay, and all the other code will remain the same. We'll still have, session factory dot get current session, and then we take that session and we say session dot get, and we still load our user class with our user ID that we're passing in, etc., etc. All that code is still identical. The only difference is we put one more extra line of code. This is the magic. This is where all this episode, everything that we'll be talking about, comes into focus with this one beautiful line of code. And that is Hibernate Dot Initialize. Okay, so we'll say Hibernate Dot Initialize. Again, let me just double check, make sure that that is the absolute correct line of code. Yes, Hibernate Dot Initialize. And then inside of the brackets, because it's an initialization method that we're calling, inside of the brackets, we put in the object, the join that we want to have initialized. So in this case, the join would be user dot get addresses. Okay, because that's the method that we called inside of, let's say, the view inside of the presentation layer. We called that method and it failed. So now we're going to call that method inside of the scope of our DAO, and we're going to call it inside of the scope of the Hibernate.initialize method call. Okay, it would be a static method. So with that static method call, Hibernate will realize that you want to invoke the join and maintain that join outside of the scope of the session. Okay, so after the session closes, you're still going to have access to that information. So that's great. So that's the magic. That's it. That's all you need to do. So I created a separate method, and I say get user ID or get user by ID with addresses. All that's different is I put in that Hibernate.initialize and I put in user.getAddresses. Hibernate knows to persist that in memory, rather, not persist it, but I guess that's a bad word to choose. But remember that we are invoking the join. And now inside of your view, everything will work fine so long as we make reference to that new DAO class. Okay, if we're still using the old DAO class, which did not have the Hibernate.initialize, it won't work. But we need to make sure that we use reference to the new one, and there you go. There you have it. So now in a situation where you need to get access to the address information, you can call the get user by ID with addresses. Or let's say you're in a situation where you just want to verify the user credentials, or you only need to work with whatever's on the base user table with no joins, then you can call get user by ID, okay, with addresses attached to it. And that will just get a query to the actual base table, and we are good to go. Okay, so that's sort of that's the way I use, and that's the way it works great for me. But if you are in a situation where you have a huge system with a huge amount of different joins, and you don't want to create a method for every single different type of join, then I could see you probably wanting to create a more generic way to access this. And what I've seen happen in the past in the company I used to work for, what they did was you could pass in, so you'd have your generic get method, so you have your get user by ID method, but then you would also have to pass in a string or something, some sort of piece of data that tells the code what types of joins to actually instantiate. Okay, so I guess maybe in this situation we would type in, I have no idea what you would do. I've never done this before, but maybe you can just type in a string format the actual string that you would use to invoke the join on. So I maybe pass in user.getAddresses or something like that, and you could put in a bunch of them. You could say user.getProfiles, user.get whatever, what have you. And you could pass all those in, and then what you can do is you can run a Hibernate Initialize for every single one of those lines of code, or every single one of those strings that you passed in. You could run the Hibernate Initialize on those. Okay, you might need to use reflection there to be able to get that working properly. Again, I've never used this approach before, but just to give you some ideas, spitballing some ideas off the top of my head on how you could implement a more generic system, that could be one way of doing it. Okay. So there you have it. Short, sweet, and to the point. An episode that is shorter than 30 minutes, and you get a big bang for your buck with what it is that I gave to you for today. So just to recap again, fetch types are related to Hibernate and having relationships. They are applied only on relationships like the at one to many or at many to one annotations. And by default, it uses lazy loading. If you want to, you can specify fetch equal to fetch type.eager, and that will automatically load every single different join that you may have that exists inside of an object. However, that's not very performant. That can be very bad if you have a lot of joins, and that can quickly get out of hand, especially if you have joins on joins on joins on joins. It can grow exponentially, so that's why we prefer lazy loading and specifying in code which different joins to actually instantiate on our own using lazy loading. Cool? Excellent. Now, what I've done for you guys for this particular episode, and I think I'm going to do this for every single other episode moving forward, is that I've put together a special video that outlines exactly how to go about doing this. So I show you a real-world example, and I go through a few key aspects of this concept inside of a video that I've put together for you guys. So if you go to the show notes page for this episode at howtoprogramwithjava.com/session57, or if you're already on this page and you've already clicked the play button because you're curious, then you're already there. You're in exactly the right place. What you can do is you can download the actual video that complements this post. Well, you'll see me showing you exactly how to go about doing this lazy loading stuff, as well as the eager fetching stuff inside of a real-world example application. Okay, so I've actually created the users and addresses objects, and I have the controller, and I have all the means by which to show the functionality of the lazy and eager fetching systems. So you can go to that page and you can see exactly what's going on inside of that video. Again, you can go to howtoprogramwithjava.com/session57. And you'll see at the very bottom of the post, I will have a link that will allow you to get access to that video. Sound good? Sounds good. So take care of yourselves, guys. Again, if this is your first time hearing this podcast, I would highly recommend you subscribe to the podcast by going to howtoprogramwithjava.com/love, LOVE. You can go to that link. It'll automatically open up the iTunes application on your computer, and you'll be able to click the subscribe button near the top left-hand corner of the iTunes screen. And if you really love us so much and you want to get the word out about this podcast and share it with your friends and get more people on board with listening to this stuff, you can leave a rating and review. If you leave a 5-star rating plus leave a review, I will actually give you the nod in the next episode, at the top of the next episode, and say hi and read the actual comment that you left inside of the review. So that'll be really cool stuff. And as a side note, after you leave a rating and review, it takes a few minutes, like 10 or 20 minutes before it actually shows up. So don't worry if you don't see your rating and review right away. Just need to give it a little bit of time, and then iTunes will approve it, and it'll show up inside of the iTunes application, and I will be able to get it and read it at the top of the next episode. So thank you so much for listening. I really hope you enjoyed this episode, and I can't wait to see you again in the next episode, which is going to be session 58, where we will probably continue our talk on all things Hibernate, and eventually, well, who knows where we're going to go from there. The sky is the limit. I can't wait to be there. I can't wait to see you there, and I can't wait to teach, and for you guys to learn. So take care of yourselves. Bye for now. Have a great one. Happy learning.
Thanks for listening to the How to Program with Java podcast. Please visit howtoprogramwithjava.com for more useful Java tutorials.